Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable. My name is Adam Benson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Library and Archives, back around the corner down the hallway. Once again, we're happy to have a partnership with the York Civil War Roundtable between us and between Roundtable and the York County History Center. I think we have a very popular speaker this evening. It's nice to see a lot of people that I've never seen before. Roundtable. It's been a little thin for the last 3 years or so. I'm not sure why, but moving on, if you can bear with me for a few minutes, I have a few upcoming events that the History Center is putting on over the next few weeks, and then I'll be introducing Scott Rosenau, who will be introducing tonight's speaker. Coming up on this coming Monday, May 22nd at 7:00 p.m. is our bookmarked Zoom book club. That takes place entirely online on Zoom. You can find instructions on how to register for that on our website. And the book talk will be on 480 Cadora Street, Surviving Unpredictability, written by Sandra Curse Stockton, New York resident. And she will be available for the book talk to discuss her experiences and her family's experiences growing up in New York. On Thursday, May 25th, next Thursday, and on June 1st, we are hoping to have Dungeons and Dragons, the Battle for Colonial New York. This is a bit outside of our normal scheduled programming. We're trying to do a Dungeons and Dragons theme based in the colonial period of New York. It's a new program. So if you're interested in this, please check out our website for registration and instructions on what you need to do. Coming up on Thursday, June 8th, our Writers Roundtable, which is a library event. And our speakers will be Dominish Miller, who spoke before the Roundtable last year, and Corey Van Broekhoven. And Dominish and Corey will be doing sort of a mutual / dueling presentation, The Other Side of the River, Similarities that York and Lancaster counties share. So please remember June 8th, 7:00 p.m. Writers Roundtable. On Sunday, Sunday, June 11th at 2:30 p.m., the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be here in this room. That's 2:30 p.m. on June 11th. And the program will be Unearthing Camp Security, famous American Revolution POW camp. Unearthing Camp Security, presented by John Cromer, who is an accomplished archaeologist. That's on June 11th. And finally, on June 14th, part of our new Hidden History series, this Wednesday, June 14th from 6 to 7 p.m. This event is actually taking place across the street at First Presbyterian Church's Cafe 225. And Guy Dunham, a retired pastor of 12 different congregations, will speak at First Pres on famous Yorker David Eder Small, who was an advocate for freedom seekers, otherwise known as escaped slaves, runaway slaves, in the 1800s. So we'll be talking about York's many connections to the Underground Railroad and the work that Small did in helping people escape the horrors of slavery. So that's on June 14th. So I'm going to let Scott Rosenau come up and talk about next month's event, as well as introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to the History Center. And I'm glad to see a big crowd tonight, kind of back to our pre-COVID numbers that we're looking at tonight. So I'm happy to see that. So just to preview, like Adam said, what's coming up next month. Next month, as we meet on the third Wednesday, that's going to be June 21st. We're going to welcome back local historian and Roundtable favorite, James McClure. He's written a lot of books, a lot of articles about York County history. He's a retired editor of the York Daily Record and Sunday News. And he was USA Today's network stated editor for Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. He served as East Region editor for the Digital First Media. He holds a master's degree in American Studies from Penn State Harrisburg, where his research focused on York County journalism history. He's the author or co-author of 9 books on York County history and moderates the 15,000 member Retro York Facebook group, which I have joined, and there are a lot of interesting articles. Want to check those out as well. past president of the Pennsylvania Associated Press Managing Editors, and past president of the Pennsylvania Society of Newspaper Editors. And he led the York Daily Record and Sunday News history teams that won 2 G. Richard Dew Awards for journalistic service, Pennsylvania's most prestigious honor for outstanding journalism. McClure will be telling York County's full Civil War history, full Civil War story at last. When York County and America observed the Battle of Gettysburg, Centennial 1963, York's newspapers covered community observations in Wrightsville and Hanover, but there was scant coverage of York's role a century before when the Confederates raided the county the days before the fighting at Gettysburg. McClure traces the way York discussed or sat in silence regarding those days marked by York's father's surrender of the town to the Confederates. Follows a telling of York's Civil War and relayed the Underground Railroad story up to the current day. A moment marked by extensive and thoughtful research in those days when the Confederates marched across York County soil. Tonight, we're rejoined by another local favorite and local historian, member of our roundtable, Scott Mingus. He's the author or co-author of more than 30 books, soon to be 90, it seems like, at the rate he's going. More than 30 books about Civil War and Underground Railroad. He has a couple new books that recently came out about the Battle of Hanover, second volume of his book with Eric Wittenberg about if we were striking for Pennsylvania, about the lead up to the Gettysburg campaign. That also just recently came out. A lot of other interesting books that he's written. So tonight we're going to listen as Scott brings us some news stories that he's discovered and written about Union and Confederate spies in York County. So let's welcome Scott to be recorded.
Can everybody hear me okay? Sounds good, thanks. When you think of spies, at least for me, I grew up watching I Spy and 007 and a lot of television shows, Get Smart, maybe make fun of a lot of these type shows. But spies were always really kind of a fascinating topic to me. I enjoy good spy stories. I raided my local library in my hometown multiple times to make sure that I could read about what the latest espionage was. Here I am, 8, 9-year-old kid devouring books on the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that, the spy network and the Cold Wars that were going on. So Bridge of Spies, when it came out, was probably my favorite spy movie of all time. How many of you are aware that here in York County, Pennsylvania, there was an active spy network during the Civil War? We're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. We go through here. So if I turn it on, there we go. Now, York County in 1860, we're going to talk a little bit about politics because politics is going to play in to how the spy network actually operated here in York County. In 1860, this county has about 68,000 people. It's still largely an agricultural region that's starting to make the transition into industry. We've got a number of factories that are now starting up. There are tanneries, there are iron foundries along the river, there are a number of people that are involved in light and now starting to be heavy industry, but farming is still very, very important for this region. And you can see just the population dispersion. I mean, out of those 68,000 people, you've only got 3 population centers that are of any size whatsoever. York then, as now, the largest town between Harrisburg and Baltimore, and had Wrightsville and Hanover that were roughly a little over 1,000 to 1,500 apiece. That's what it looked like. Now, if we quickly look at the presidential vote in York County in 1860, you'll see that this county voted pretty much overwhelmingly against Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas, voted somewhat for Abraham Lincoln. He actually managed to get over 5,000 votes in the county. But most of the people in this county supported a Southern Democrat, or what's called a fusion ticket, with Vice President John C. Breckinridge, a slave-owning Kentucky, what today's world would be called a millionaire. And he was the Vice President underneath Buchanan. Still very popular in this region because of his connection to Buchanan and because of the southern border. And Jim talks a lot about that. We'll talk probably more about that, next month. Well, this is kind of politics. But here's what's fascinating. you look at the national vote, we're all familiar with this, of course, green being John Breckinridge votes. There is York County, one of a handful of Pennsylvania counties that vote for the Southern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge, which of course much of the South is going to do. What's fascinating to me though is to look at how the county votes. If you look at this area, red of course is Republican, blue is Democrat. And again, the closer you are to Maryland, by and large, with a couple exceptions, a big exception in Hanover, by and large, this county pretty much, particularly the rural areas in the west and the center of the county, they support the Southern Democrats. In fact, in some of these areas, they're pretty violently anti-Lincoln. There's a story told later in 1865 in Roundtable about a person who gets arrested for disloyalty because he said Lincoln should have been shot long ago, should have been shot at the start of the war. And that just shows, in a lot of these areas, there was very strong ties to the South. That's going to play into our narrative tonight. So York, this is a view of what York might have looked like during the Civil War as an artist's sketch. You see the train station here in the foreground. You've got, of course, the old courthouse right here. But again, surrounded almost entirely on all sides by farmland. So most of this region, again, are very agrarian in nature. Now, one of the concerns as the Civil War starts is those areas of the North that are close to southern borders. There's a lot of concern about whether those areas are going to stay loyal and how the Confederates are going to operate in those areas. I grew up in the hills of southeastern Ohio. That was an area that also supported Southern Democrats. In fact, one of the leading copperhead Southern Democrats in the entire Civil War, Clement Vallandigham, was from Southern Ohio. He, of course, ends up banished to Canada for his anti-Lincoln rhetoric. But there's this major concern throughout the North. Now, here in York, the chief burgess of the town in York Borough is a guy named David Small, who was a newspaper editor, head of the Democratic Party in downtown York. But he understands that we are now going to war because the news of the attack upon capture of Fort Sumter and the president called for 75,000 troops caused the feeling the most intense excitement in the pervading talk community was war, war, war. So you've got this dichotomy again operating in York County, where people did not vote for Lincoln, do not necessarily agree with Lincoln's war policies, but they do understand that we've got a union we've got to try to preserve in this particular case. And so the county's going to respond to Lincoln. You've got volunteers that are coming on board throughout York County, including those Democratic regions in Southern York County. Many of these farm boys do indeed sign up. And you can see the stats. Most of the officers a little better educated, certainly wealthier. But to get an idea of what the county would have looked like. But here comes the first hint of something that's not quite kosher about the events. Walter Jennifer serves at Carlisle Barracks as a cavalry instructor. He's also one of America's best-known saddle designers. The Jennifer saddle has been widely regarded by the U.S. Cavalry. In fact, the 2nd U.S. Dragoons, the 2nd U.S. Cavalry that he serves in, has used this as their major saddle. Now, he's at Carlisle Barracks. He is a Marylander. He is a Marylander who is not loyal to the Union. He's not loyal to Lincoln. He's got his own ideas. He resigns from the United States Army, gets on a Northern Central train, and starts heading down towards Maryland. Well, somehow or another, he ends up in Hanover. Long story on how he gets there. But let's stop back for a minute. He walks into Hanover at the exact same time as Hanover's in the middle of the crisis. There have been rumors on April 18th and 19th that the Confederates in Baltimore were going to come to Hanover. In fact, there was a group called the Rowdies, so they were particularly concerned about a group of young men, pro-Confederate, pro-secessionist, and there were reports that they had arrived at Westminster, Maryland, and would shortly be marching on Hanover. They sent out patrols from Hanover. Some of the citizens get guns, and they start thinking that we've got a secessionist approach. And then Jennifer shows up right in the middle of this. And he's a widely known celebrity in his day. Remember, this is a farming region. They knew this guy. He's a saddle manufacturer of quite some renown. So he shows up in Hanover, it would be like a movie star showing up today in Hanover, and they look at Walter Jennifer and they say, okay, this guy's a good, it's one of those Baltimore guys. And so they clap him in arms, they arrest Jennifer on suspicion of being a Confederate spy, figuring that there's only one reason he's in Hanover, and that's to talk about the vital military importance of Hanover, Pennsylvania. They had a little bit of a perhaps elevated view of Hanover's importance, but they thought this guy was there to spy on the railroad network, to spy on Hanover in general. They clap him in leg irons. A.W. Eichelberger shows up, who's the president of the Hanover Branch Railroad and a leading citizen. Eichelberger Center in Hanover, for those who are familiar with the town, named for him. Eichelberger pleads for mercy for this guy, and they finally decide, all right, let's send him up to the governor. So they clap this guy back in arms, put him on a train, send him back up to Harrisburg, and then he end up talking to the governor, and the governor finally says, well, okay, we'll finally let you go. And the first thing he does is he goes back, becomes a lieutenant colonel of the 8th Virginia Cavalry, and promptly reports on the railroad connections through York County. He reports on what was going on at the Carlisle U.S. Barracks. He reads Jennifer's report back to the Confederacy. This guy maybe he wasn't spying, but he sure was a very observant person. And he wrote down a whole lot of stuff that he saw in this particular area. And what that starts doing is it launches into people's minds, who do we trust? Any Southerner passing through York County instantly becomes under suspicion. Who are these people? Why are they here? Where are they going? Why are they asking those questions? What's going on? And for a while, there's almost this sense of paranoia that starts to come into South Central Pennsylvania, because you got similar stories going on in Franklin and Adams and Fulton counties. As again, soldiers stream out of the Carlisle barracks, take the railroads to the south, whether they the Cumberland Valley Railroad or the Baltimore, Wilmington and Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, Northern Central, B&O, whatever. These guys are returning to the south. And again, they're riding northern rails and they're taking notes as they're going down through these areas. So again, it's becoming kind of an issue of what's going on. Particularly here in York County, there's a concern about the railroad. I keep in mind the Northern Central Railway has been a Confederate target almost from the very beginning. On April 18th and 19th, 1861, not within a week after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, pro-Confederate militia headed by the Major General of Maryland State Militia, a guy named Isaac Trimble, later gets shot at Pickett's charge. But Isaac Trimble, a future Confederate general, kidnaps a train of the PWB, burns down a number of bridges, and rides the train north in an attempt to seize the crossing at Havre de Grace over the Susquehanna River. They're also going to burn down several railroad bridges, not only on the PWB, but also in the Northern Central. That again starts sparking reactions. And in the middle of that, at Lowe's Methodist Campground, down by Shrewsbury off the old trail, reports circulate down there that there's been a fight, that Confederate sympathizers have crossed the border into York County and have shot up a Union base along the railroad, which is near the railroad down there. Turns out, no, it's a bunch of guys out squirrel hunting or whatever. Nobody's concerned about that. Turns out the Baltimore Rowdies, by the way, were a group of Confederate volunteers from Baltimore going to Westminster to enlist in the Confederate Army, but they were never coming to Hanover. But you can just see this continuing to percolate, continue to worry that they're coming this area. And so the U.S. Army starts guarding the railroad tracks here in York County in particular, down at Baltimore County, worrying about what's going on. Now, one of the things that early on, the United States Army is using the Northern Central Railway and York County as one of the major routes to send supplies to the newly formed Army of Virginia, later to be renamed Army of the Potomac. And of course, the Northern Central is going to play a key role, as does the Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore. Now, the guy on the right is Fletcher Webster, United States statesman Daniel Webster, one of the great triumvirate of individuals that worked so hard to foster compromise in Congress, him and John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. Let's Daniel Webster's son. He's colonel of the 20 Massachusetts. They are going to end up taking a train ride through York County. Now, I probably could ride my bicycle, well, in my younger days, could ride my bicycle faster than this guy was driving his train. They end up taking 5.5 hours to get from the train to go from Glen Rock to Cockeysville. 5.5 hours. Guys, that's about a 25 to 30-minute train ride normally. They're just creeping along. And these Massachusetts boys on board are very concerned about their being led into an ambush. In fact, those of you who ride this steam into history Northern Central Railway of York County trains have taken that route down south of Glen Rock. It's pretty, even today, it's pretty deserted. There's a lot of farmland. There are a lot of trees in that area. It's a place where you could easily ambush a train. And so Fletcher Webster finally says, stop. We got to do something a little bit different here. He calls for volunteers and asks if anybody here can drive a train. As it turns out, Paul Revere's grandson is a private in this regiment, doesn't know Daniel Webster's son, but the two of them are introduced and he gets on board, and they're in Baltimore within a matter of 20 minutes from Cockeysville. Train highballs it, no problems at all. But a report goes back to the United States Army from Colonel Webster about this suspicion that perhaps the train engineer was in cahoots with the Southerners, because the territory through which we rolled was certainly not in its Union proclivities. In other words, these people are well aware that Southern York County is anti-Lincoln territory, and they're quite concerned as they go through this area that something untoward is going to happen. Nothing does happen at that point, but it just goes back to continuing to foster this suspicion of maybe there's something going on here. This happens to be Hanover Junction. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. The train, of course, would have rolled through Hanover Junction on its way to the south. Hanover Junction itself is a place that the U.S. Army takes a keen interest in. This is a fairly important train station. It has the spur that leads off to the left that goes to Gettysburg, and of course is the main line of the Northern Central that runs down into Baltimore County, and at the time ran all the way up to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, later during the war to Elmira, New York. But that train station, and again, this whole idea of these railroads that ran between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Maryland, of course, is a slave state. It's been forced to stay loyal to the Union by President Lincoln. He has suspended the writ of habeas corpus. We've had the State versus Merriman case where Lincoln ends up justifying his activities. But there's this tremendous concern about these railroads that keep running between free Pennsylvania and slave Maryland. How loyal are these crews, particularly the crews like the Northern Central's crews, that almost many of them, at least majority of them, are based in Baltimore, and they're Marylanders. But not a lot of Pennsylvanians. You look down the roster of the Northern Central in 1861, it's mostly Marylanders. The same is true for the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, and the same is true for the other railroads in the region. This happens to be a view you cannot replicate today without getting killed in the middle of the Jones Falls Expressway. That's I-83, where the artist would have been positioning himself as he takes this lovely picture of what today is a tree-covered hill. You can't see anything there, but that was the main campsite of the 87th Pennsylvania Infantry. York County's regiment raised, they're sent down to the south. Their number one goal early in the war is guard that railroad. And again, because many of these men are York Countyans, they kind of know who the people are, particularly Baltimore County and York County. And so having a loyal regiment, Union regiment in that position might help stop some of the spy activities. Their camp is visited frequently by Marylanders, frequently. The Marylanders express an interest in what the Union soldiers are doing, how many of them are there, et cetera, et cetera. And they certainly are writing back reports about this unusual interest that the Marylanders are taking in their regiment. and in the railroad in general. But here in York, it's really difficult for anybody in York to start figuring out who's loyal, who's not, particularly if you're not from York County. If you're from York County, it's not so bad. If you're from Manheim Township, they gave 174 votes to John Breckinridge. Bill, hold up 2 fingers. They gave 2 votes to Abraham Lincoln. So you know almost nobody in Manheim Township likes Lincoln. As you go farther north in the county, you get a little bit more going on. But York County is in the middle of the turnpike. I just drove a 12-hour round trip yesterday back and forth to Ohio on the turnpike. I saw it in the morning, I saw it again at night. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, I-76, did not, of course, exist during the Civil War. The turnpike was what we now know as the Lincoln Highway. That ran from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And so York County is constantly filled with strangers. It's the nature of the beast. They're coming through the small towns. They're sleeping in our hotels. They're having their horses shoed in our livery stables. They're eating in our restaurants. But who are these people? We don't know. They're travelers on the turnpike. They're just passing through. Sometimes they linger for days. Sometimes they'll linger for weeks. Sometimes they just simply move on. But there's all kinds of, again, suspicions starting to be raised about, who are these people as they're coming through? And obviously, there are some early spy stories of people who are here on behalf of the Confederate government, that they are starting to lay the groundwork for a potential invasion of Pennsylvania. Now, the summer of 1862, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson calls in Major Alexander Boteler, who happens to be a Confederate congressman, into his tent. He's the chief of ordnance for Jackson's wing of the Army of Northern Virginia. And he will tell Boteler, give me 36,000 men and I would take the war to the banks of the Susquehanna River. Boteler never gets to give him the men because Jackson's recalled and is sent to the Virginia Peninsula. But this idea of coming to Pennsylvania starts percolating in Confederate literature. You start reading what's left of the Confederate official records and the details of the Secretary of War in his office. John Jones, war clerk in Richmond, writes a lot about this need for information in the North. We need to understand, if we're going to invade the North, what is needed, what are the road networks, what are the people like in this particular region. And one of the key things that attracts a lot of attention is Camp Scott. Camp Winfield Scott was near the old fairgrounds, southeast of the intersection of King and Queen Street. It wasn't off Carlisle like it is today. It was down southeastern side of York. And again, a lot of these passers-by end up, you read the old newspaper accounts from 1861 and 62. There are big crowds, particularly on Sunday afternoons, to watch these soldiers drill. And these men are counting the numbers of soldiers, they're counting the numbers of cannons, ostensibly for letters to write home. Yeah, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I found a couple of accounts that talk about in Richmond, that talk about the number of troops that are at the various U.S. camps in South Central Pennsylvania, Camp Curtin, Camp Scott, etc., Camp Misery, whatever his official name was, at Chambersburg. But they're starting to get this information, and it's starting to circulate throughout the South as to what is here north of the Mason-Dixon line. Another thing that's of keen interest to them again is the U.S. Army Hospital. The guards from there are from Maryland. They're from Southern Maryland. They're from Ellicott City. And again, there's some questions early on about these Marylanders that are here in York and what are they really doing. And I've got a few stories on those that are coming. But really, a lot of the concern in York centers on this place. Did you ever go to the Holy Hound wine bar? Back during the Civil War, this was the Tremont House. Before that, it was the National Hotel. This is, of course, a very popular, extremely well preserved and restored former Jack's department store, now turned into back into some of its original use. It's owned by a Baltimore man, and it's always for long in the 1840s and 50s. This has been a hangout for Marylanders particularly slave catchers, or as more properly known as bounty hunters. Folks who are coming north from Maryland, staying in this hotel, and they're out looking for freedom seekers, roaming throughout York County. They're learning the roads of York County. They're learning the area because they're trying to find these freedom seekers. Well, during the Civil War, there's still a whole lot of Marylanders that keep parading into the Tremont House Hotel. Again, and we have reports that this is also a fairly popular place for Union officers, particularly officers at the U.S. Army base, Camp Scott, early in the war, and then later the U.S. Army Hospital. This is a very popular place for them to stay. And they have dinner there fairly often, and the waiters and other people in the room seem to be taking a little too much interest in what's going on at these officers' tables. And again, you start getting this whole network of suspicion on what's going on as we come through here into York County. Fast forward to 1863. We're going to spend the bulk of our time tonight talking about the spy network during the Gettysburg campaign. We have a lot more documentation on that. We know a lot more about it. Let's step back. Remember Jackson back in 1862? It said, give me 36,000 men and I will take the war to the banks of Susquehanna. Didn't do that, but he convinced Robert E. Lee when Lee took over the army that yes, we're going to go to Pennsylvania. And we all know his first division of Pennsylvania stopped at the Battle of Sharpsburg on September 17th, 1862, Antietam to we Yankees. And a month later, in what's not widely known, Jeb Stuart arrives in Franklin County with a couple thousand Confederate cavalrymen. They're going to burn the Cumberland Valley Railroad's facilities, and they're going to head towards Gettysburg. They come within 6 miles of Gettysburg before they turn around and leave and head back down to Virginia. That launches fear throughout South Central Pennsylvania that the rebels eventually are going to come to this area. Jackson is still convinced that the goal has to be Harrisburg. He's got a lot of reasons for it, not the least of which is, he thinks that a political victory by taking a major northern capital will do wonders for sending Lincoln to the negotiating table. But he calls in an old friend of his, Jedediah Hotchkiss. Hotchkiss, before the Civil War, is a school teacher. In his summer drop from teaching, what does he do? Jedediah Hotchkiss walks the roads of South Central Pennsylvania as a hobby. He's an amateur map maker. So he starts sketching. Where am I going? Where's this road lead to? Where's that road lead to? Hotchkiss has become pretty good at doing sketches of maps, etc. He, by 1863, has become the Confederate Army's chief topographer. Doesn't yet have the rank of major, he will later do that. But this guy understands, particularly the Cumberland Valley. That's going to be the avenue of invasion, of course, but in 1862, 63, and 64. But what he does, he calls Hotchkiss into his tent, and he says, make me a map of the Valley of Pennsylvania to Harrisburg. Keep this a profound secret. And so Jedediah Hotchkiss sends out teams of 2 or 3 individuals throughout South Central Pennsylvania. And their only express goal is to draw this map of the route of invasion, starting in the Shenandoah Valley, going all the way up to Harrisburg. Have you ever seen that map? Ever heard of this map before? The map, believe it or not, still exists. Hotchkiss's original map. For those who have never seen it, whoops, here we go. One way, we'll go this way. That's Hotchkiss's original map. That's Hanover Junction, 7 valleys. Look at the names of every farmer in the region. There's our Cold Spring Station. I mean, this is the map the Confederate Army is going to produce of York County. Every single major farm, every single road in York County, they're all on this map. I've taken that map, I've looked at it, it's god awful, wonderful map. if you're a soldier. Except it has one major problem. Notice the hills. There are none. York County's flat. Little do the Confederates know when they came here that we're not exactly a flat Kansas. This is a little different to Washport. And they cannot do that on these maps. There are no elevation lines. There's very few hills. Other than Round Top, there's not a single hill on this map at all. But he's got everything else on this map. Now, if I go back one, there's an old legend in York County that I always thought wasn't true. Until I found a newspaper article from 1880s that at least told me part of the story is true. Here's the legend part. Here in York County, a one-armed Bible salesman goes throughout the county and he starts selling Bibles or taking subscriptions for Bibles, telling people, you know, when I come back in the summer, I'll bring your Bibles. And so he goes all over the county according to legend, and he starts selling Bibles or again taking these subscriptions. That's the legend part. And he says, I'm going to come back with my friends, and you know, he'll be back later in the uniform of Confederate major. Okay. What really happens, where the legend grew from, is this team of scouts that Jedediah Hotchkiss has sent to York County. They hire a drag or a wagon, if you will, and they have a taxi driver take them all over York County. So that part's true. Whether this guy has one arm or not, I don't know. But they do go all over York County, and they do seek out key roads. They seek out names of key farmers. They seek out what's going on. And this team then eventually will return back into wherever they came from, Virginia in this case, and they come back at least one more time in York County just to check their details, check their facts. So they're here at least twice. Yeah, the legend of hyperbole is that this one-armed guy and his two buddies come back in Confederate uniforms, they dump a box of Bibles in York Center Square and says, look, I'm back with my buddies, here they are, here's Jubal Early, here's the Confederate Army. Well, that part I don't have a lot of documentation on. Well, we do have documentation that these spies are active in York County, and we know for sure they're active because, again, that's what results. If you ever get a chance, this map is online. The Virginia Historical Society, you can look it up. It's also a hard copy that I've used at the Handley Library in Winchester, Virginia, a place I go a lot. And so you can actually peruse one of the original maps that's still there. It's a huge, unbelievably big map. Covers Franklin, Fulton, Adams, Lancaster, Cumberland counties, as well as Maryland and Northern Virginia. It's an incredible document. While all this goes on, these Confederates start making plans to come to Pennsylvania. Stonewall Jackson, Jedediah Hotchkiss, we don't know how many copies of this are produced. I know of at least 3 or 4 copies that still exist, but how many of there were, I don't know. But I do know these Confederates were quite active in trying to copy these maps, known as the Hotchkiss map, and trying to keep these in circulation for the Confederate officers, who still at this point, other than a handful, don't know they're coming to Harrisburg or that they're coming to Pennsylvania. Now, Robert E. Lee has many reasons for heading this way, not the least of which is winning a victory in Copperhead country, southern Lancaster County, southern Adams County, southern York County, particularly, southern Franklin County. Where can he win a victory in an area that might rise up politically and say, enough's enough, Mr. Lincoln, we are done. Let's try to do that. And he's got a lot of other reasons, of course. There's another key one, threaten the railroads. Remember how much interest the Confederates have been taking in the railroads of Pennsylvania? And I document a lot of that in my various books on that. As well as diverting attention from Vicksburg, which they do. They send Ambrose Burnside, the Union Ninth Corps, goes hustling back from Tennessee to Cincinnati, Ohio, and then comes to Columbus, and they'll make it as far as my hometown of Zanesville, Ohio, on their way back to Pennsylvania. While all this is going on, Lincoln calls for 100,000 volunteers to try to stop the Confederate invasion. And men start signing up for the army. Governor Curtin takes half of those 50,000 men and says, here they come. Not realizing that there have already been Confederates in South Central Pennsylvania, because the Union spy network doesn't really operate and understand that. This, of course, is the Confederate objectives. They want to take Carlisle, march on Harrisburg, take Gettysburg. Nobody really cares about Gettysburg. The real goal is here. York, Wrightsville. Dillsburg is important because Dillsburg is the connection point between the two wings, and some Confederate accounts suggest they want to fight the Battle of Dillsburg. So there's a lot of activity centered on trying to understand the Mingus road network that's here in the river region. And also you'll notice from Harrisburg down to kind of Wayne, Maryland, only one bridge here at Wrightsville and two bridges up to Harrisburg, a couple more up to St. Mary's and Rockville up here. But by and large, you can't get to Harrisburg really easily unless you start understanding those bridges. And this one, in particular, York County is going to attract the attention of the Confederate spy network. Now, everybody's pretty much aware this bridge is important. I've got a letter in my collection that I bought a few years ago, George Brown and Newberry. I George Gilbert Curtin spelled wrong, will burn the bridge before they will allow it to cross peacefully. The rebels, the rivers raised 7 feet in the last 48 hours. They possibly keep them out of the place. So the bridge network, everybody in this area understands that the Confederates are likely going to go for the bridge. And the US Army, of course, understands that as well. And they start having people monitoring the bridge. This is a turnpike bridge, folks. You got any idea how many people are crossing that bridge? Constantly. Strangers, some of which are Southerners. Some of which are Marylanders, many of which are from Delaware or other border regions. And so there's this, again, concern about those bridges. What's going to happen there? On June 21st, Peter Saylor, 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia. That is a militia group from the Pottsville, Tamaqua, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area. They're guarding the bridge at Wrightsville. Saylor's in charge of the Provost Guard. He reports in the official records of the Union Army. They arrest 3 different strangers, all of whom are on the bridge or near the bridge, who are trying to get information about the bridge, and they're telling all kinds of different stories. And I like this, here, they confined in the town hall during the night, sent the Lancaster, the provost Marshal Polonius on Monday morning. They prove to be deserters. They're not spies. Well, maybe they are, maybe they're not, but they're Union deserters. And again, this whole idea of who are these strangers that are starting to go across our bridge? And that starts to be percolating. And more and more and more men are captured, lurking in and around the bridge, some of which have no explanation for who they are, many of which are forwarded to either Fort Delaware or Fort McHenry, some of whom are going to stay in prison for the rest of the war, because they cannot explain why they're in that region, or they make the mistake of speaking with a Southern drawl. And they're like, you're done, we're not letting you out. June 15th through the 18th, you've got Confederate cavalry coming into Franklin County, of course. And while that's going on, the Union Army starts desperately trying to find information on what's happening. This is George Sharp. He is the commander of the Bureau of Military Intelligence. He and his fellow Union spy network, secret agents, started enlisting the help of civilians. And pretty soon, within a 2-week period, there are a massive amount of civilians enrolled in this secret group, headed by David McConaughey, an attorney in downtown Gettysburg, one of the guys who's later the father of the Gettysburg National Cemetery, and of course is the guy who invites Abraham Lincoln to come speak for the Gettysburg Address. McConaughey, William Bender Wilson of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and a number of other people developed this network. And so these civilians, they find civilians who are mostly farm boys, who are really good writers, who have a keen sense of intelligence, and are very good observers. And they put these farm boys out on the roads in Maryland. These are citizens from York County, Adams County. And they're going to put these guys on the roads down in Baltimore County, in Hartford County, all the way across into Carroll and Frederick County. They are watching the roads. And they have this network of these farmers, and they'll ride 15 or 20 miles, they'll turn the information over to the next farmer, jumps on his horse, and they will eventually reach the Pennsylvania Railroad. And every single Pennsylvania Railroad telegraph operator had been alerted by William Bender Wilson, who is the director of telegraphs for the PRR, that when these people ride in, their messages get priority. You're gonna drop anything you're doing right away. I don't care if it's a train collision coming, drop it, send the message to Harrisburg. And so all these messages that Sharp's people through these farm boys are, yes, you have a question?
Just on telegraph, could you tell, how did they tell if a telegraph office has been captured or if it was still operating?
Oh, how do they tell when they're operating? But at this point, the Confederates weren't quite into this part of Pennsylvania yet. So, but obviously you could tell from the local intelligence when the Confederates arrived. This network's going to get a lot trickier in the next week as more and more of these stations fall. But this week on June 15th through the 22nd, nothing has fallen yet in Pennsylvania as far as major telegraph stations. So they're still able to keep this network going. They had lost the telegraph station at Greencastle, but they got it back up and running within a day. So at this point, and again, the idea is if one's gone, go around it. Again, the ultimate goal is to send a message physically to the Pennsylvania Railroad. And that's where they would start tapping it out. You know, if they happen to tap it out early in Greencastle or Marion or Chambersburg or wherever, that's fine. But the idea was to try to get the message to the PRR. And William Bender Wilson, again, being the head of the telegraph operations for the railroad, later for the Union Army, Wilson would then make sure those messages got through. There were 2 telegraphs set up in Harrisburg to receive these messages. One was on the windowsill in an office of the secretary to Governor Curtin. The other one was in the office of Major General Dry's Couch. And so these were the people doing that. And they kept tabs of their, and a lot of these messages, they're very boring, but very interesting still as well. Almost every one of these messages still exists in the Pennsylvania State Archives. I went through them, I read them all. Curtin's telegraph things are 80% of them are political. You just got to wade through that, and there's a nugget right in the middle of it. But all of these telegraph messages from these spies to Governor Curtin to be relayed to Washington, to the War Department, they're all there. Every single one of them. And they're accurate in terms of supporting, mostly accurate. Confederates are now in Frederick. There's 22,000 commanded by Richard Ewell. Blah, blah, blah. You know, he's got 26 divisions, there were regiments, brigades, whatever. You know, all these numbers are pretty accurate. You go down through the spy network that, and again, this ends up in George Sharp's office. This ends up in Edward Stanton's office in Washington, as well as the Navy Yard, where President Lincoln can keep tabs of this as well. And so this network is Union spy activity. None of these guys ever get paid. Several of them almost get captured, back to your question, but they manage to make it up, and all these messages go relayed back through. Well, this Union network is not bad. They're doing a pretty good job. Well, the Confederates were still sending out their own agents. You have the story of Bill Mosby and Pat Kelly. They are sent by Robert E. Lee's army. We don't quite know who sends them for sure. Probably the director of Confederate intelligence. But they dress up as Cumberland Valley farmers. Now, these 2 guys had spent a lot of time, like Hotchkiss, in southern Pennsylvania. I will actually submit to you, these may be the 2 men that the legend of the one-armed Bible salesman and the 2 other guys, maybe those are these guys, because they're dressed up as farmers, they're coming around, they're asking all kinds of questions. They wear overalls, blue flannel blouses, pants tucked in the boots, straw hats. One of them carries a dung fork, probably steak in high heaven, and the other one has an old shovel. They present themselves as these poor bumpkin backwoods Chambersburg country boys. And they start asking all kinds of questions. Train schedules. Where are the troops? Who are the key manufacturers in this region? What do they make? What's happening at these different places? These guys are counting the number of horses on the farms. They're going around. Who are the major farmers? They come to York County. We know they're here in York County, Confederate records. And they're counting again, horses and cows in York County. Anybody care to know why? Robert E. Lee's army will take 67,000 cows out of Pennsylvania during the Gettysburg campaign. York County cattle is still being identified as York County cattle in the summer of 1864 in Orange County, Virginia. They're still labeled, branded whatever, as York County cattle. And so they're counting because they're going to send out scouts. Never for a minute think that the Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania was accidental when they're out going looking for horses and cows. It's no accident. They know exactly where they're going. They know which farms they want to go to. They know which place to get the maximum bang for their buck. These guys end up at Wrightsville. We know they are at the Wrightsville Bridge. Again, asking all kinds of questions. Then they disappear from history. We don't hear anything more about them after they go to Wrightsville. All right, June 19th through the 22nd, of course, now you've got more Confederates arriving. Now the infantry arrives. You got these feeble attempts to try to stop them in Gettysburg, Fairfield, etc. What that does is now clogs the roads, and more Marylanders and even people from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia now are on the roads through York County. Now try to tell me how many of these Virginians are spies or aren't spies. Because again, we have an influx of Virginians coming into the north, ostensibly because of Unionists in places like Winchester and Martinsburg, West Virginia, etc. But how many of them really are? And how many of them are Confederate spies? We'll never know. Well, there's an inordinate amount of people, again, read the arrest records in the York County archives, etc. And you start realizing they're picking up people, daily, 2, 3, 4 people every day. Are Catholic. That's Morgan Smith. Oops. There we go. That's Morgan Smith, Moravian pastor, later industrialist, and tells of great excitement. Hundreds of horses are probably to be carried from Franklin County and others. Rebels daily look for, they will certainly come. Again, verification that they're coming in from Maryland. They're coming in from the South, coming into York County. Again, who are these people? What are they doing here in our area? Now, one of the great stories in York County, and I love it, it's a story. I don't think it has much genesis truth, but the story is told of a farmer that comes in to one of the bars of downtown York, orders a couple rounds of beer, starts talking about he's your own colonel of the 8th Alabama, sent directly here by Robert E. Lee himself, commissioned. And of course, the York Countyans start plying this guy with alcohol, trying to figure out, he's going to talk a little bit more about his friends, his network. When he finally sobers up, it turns out he's from Red Lion. He just wants free booze. He's apparently not necessarily a spy. But again, this paranoia that's creeping into this area. Who do we trust? Who don't we trust? Who are spies? Who are these spies? June 22nd through the 25th, again, the infantry comes rolling in, big time. Rodney Lee tells Richard Ewell, Harrisburg comes within means, capture it. Joe Borley, sent here to York County. You all know the story. He's sent here to York. He's going to try to bust apart the railroads, etc. While all this is going on, Thursday night, June 25th, another guy gets arrested at the river. He's measuring the locks, trying to understand. He definitely has a twang. He's not going to deny the fact he's a Southerner. He says, I'm a deserter. I don't like the Confederate Army. I was impressed into it. I'm not part of it. He ends up taking the oath of allegiance, and in the U.S. Army's military wisdom, what do they do with this guy? They put him in a uniform and put him guarding the bridge of Wrightsville. A guy they just thought might be a spy. We're going to give him a gun and put him on the bridge. No, I don't know. And they may have been, but they do it, and off he goes, and he's standing on the bridge. Friday, June 26th, as we all know, Confederates take Gettysburg, start marching into this area, and head on towards York County. 6 Confederate cavalrymen are captured on a farm along what's today US Route 30, in West Manchester Township. You guys know that? We have their names. We know the exact names of these guys, all over from the 17th Virginia Cavalry, mounted infantry. Why are they in York County? Their regiments up in Cumberland County. Why are they down here? Only one reason: scout the roads. Understand? Yeah, they claim to be deserters. Well, if you're deserters, why are there 6 of you? You still got on uniforms and guns, and you still have all your Confederate military equipment. And oh, by the way, in the Confederate records, as soon as they're released from prison, they're right back with their regiments. They're not deserters, they're spies. And they're arrested here in West Manchester Township. They are interrogated, they're sent to Harrisburg. After the Gettysburg campaign, these 6 men are released, and they're right back with the Laurel Brigade serving the rest of the war with them. Saturday, June 27th, of course, is the march into York County. Virginia Cavalry's going to raid Hanover Junction. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah White is going to take over Hanover at 10 o'clock or so in the morning, Saturday, June 27th. This is Elijah White. Now, he's going to become interesting as well. Elijah White is, he's a great story. He is a Virginian living in Maryland, educated in Ohio at Gambier Kenyon College, about 20 miles away from where my kids went to college. He has served in Bloody Kansas, fighting against the Yankees. He's come back after Bloody Kansas, and he has all kinds of connections throughout Virginia and Maryland. That's going to come important in a minute because he's going to raid Hanover Junction. At 2 o'clock on Saturday, June 27th, we all know the story. Elijah White's 35th Battalion Virginia Cavalry comes rolling into Hanover Junction. They're going to knock off the 20th Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia, send them fleeing for the hills, and they're going to ride about and they're going to wreck the train station. That's not all that White does. Here's part of the story you may have never heard. While Elijah White's at Hanover Junction, T.I. Cockey, a prominent businessman and railroad man from Reisterstown, Maryland, he's going to come to Hanover Junction. How do you know the rebels were coming to Hanover Junction? Spies, network, information. He knows for some reason that Elijah White will be at Hanover Junction on June 27th. He gets 3 recruits from Hartford County who are going to enlist in the 35th Battalion Virginia Cavalry. He brings them to Hanover Junction, delivers them to White, which has Marylanders from Hartford County, as other places in the regiment. And T.I. Cotton gives White military intelligence, including the complete information on the railroad networks in the region. Elijah White, while he's at Hanover Junction, learns about the Northern Central Railway's entire route. He learns about the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. He learns about the Western Maryland Railroad. He learns about the Baltimore and Ohio. So there's active intelligence being sent to Confederates here in York County while the Confederates are here. Now, riding a horse from Reisterstown to Hanover Junction is going to take you most of the morning. Somehow or other, this guy knew where to go, what time to be there to bring his new soldiers to enroll in the Confederate forces while they're at Hanover Junction. Joe Burley, of course, seizes York on June 28th. The town's filled with people, which give us a lively animated appearance. Filled with people. Filled with people. We know who these people are, some of which are probably Confederate spies, some of which definitely are Confederate spies, in this massive crowd that's here in York. 10 o'clock in the morning, John Gordon arrives. Of course, we have this famous print here from York History Center. This shows General Hugh Borelli, this shows General John Gordon. Here is York's City Council, etc., some of York's business leaders, and they're marching in off of West Market Street. And they're going to give the complete defenses of Wrightsville, according to General Gordon, at least, a 10 to 12-year-old girl, later identified as Mary Ann Small, is going to give them to General Gordon. He thinks that they're from his spy network. As he says, the plans are written, and I quote, in a flowery woman's handwriting. So he thinks there must be a female spy somewhere out in Wrightsville who is giving him information and feeding things to him. He's really pleased. So at 6 p.m., they go attacking Wrightsville, Sunday night, June 28th. Gordon will go up on, maybe gets up on Mount Pisgah, Samuel Lewis Park, we don't know. Probably he goes on that little knoll that's about 3/4 of a mile south of San Luis Park. But he's up there with a spyglass and he says, not a single thing in that note, women's flowery handwriting, is wrong. It's all there. I saw little flags, I counted them, it matched, everything matched with the information that the spy gave me. Then, as we all know, Columbia Bridge burns down. State militia orders civilians to burn the bridge, keep the Confederates from trying to get to Harrisburg by that route. And of course, we know the wind shifts, of course, and the bridge catches on fire, and the mayor's daughter shows up and says, hey, I want to give you breakfast tomorrow morning. General Gordon, bring some of your staff, I'll feed you. Gordon goes in the next morning and figures out, I found my spy. Woman's flowery handwriting. Found her, here she is. He starts probing her loyalties and she mouths off to him. I love her quote. I must tell you how my extent and approval. My husband is a soldier of the Union Army, and my is the prayer to him is that our cause may triumph and Union be saved. Did they hear what mouth off to an enemy general? Probably not the smartest thing this woman could have did. But Gordon later writes that she's not my spy. Other than my sainted mother and my beloved wife, she's the bravest woman I've ever met. Calls her the heroine of the Susquehanna. She's not a spy. We still, to this day, don't know who the spy was in Wrightsville or passing through Wrightsville. Might have been one of these many people just going through town, but they have this map and these notes on the Union position at Wrightsville, written in a flowery woman's handwriting, delivered to a Confederate general in downtown York by a 10 to 12-year-old girl who has no Confederate proclivities. That's how detailed this network is. They're able to send messages all across the county, and they can, hand them to people and say, hey, this is the Confederate generals, and things are happening. Intelligence is being passed on throughout this area. Alabama later writes, no one but those who are eyewitnesses to the occupation of York can have any concept of the anxiety and suspense of our people during the 2 days of occupation. Are the rebels going to burn us down? Who's loyal to the rebels? And they start finding out in a hurry who's loyal to the rebels. Joe Worley stays in the Widow Metzel's house right there. See that? Still there. It's a Widow Metzel's house, of course. This building's still there. That was Footer's Jewelers for a long time. He's going to stay with Dr. Ness, a well-known Confederate sympathizer. Many of his men will roam freely throughout New York, and there were new acquaintances with York's civilians. And as Cassandra Moore Small later says, a line is drawn between those who supported the Confederacy and those who did not. That will last for a long time, in effect. Will Talbot, one more spy, left behind by Elijah White in downtown Gettysburg. He's in civilian clothes. He's hanging around the school. This is Gettysburg School. Private Thomas Smith, 7th Michigan Cavalry, arrests Talbot. They find out that he's from Elijah White. He's one of White's spies from Elijah White's network. That's the guy who's at Hanover Junction. His first officer to come into Gettysburg, first officer come into Wrightsville. He insists that he's a scout. I'm not a spy. I love how they hide behind words. I'm a military scout. To make any difference, you're going to be hung for being a spy. And they do. Hang Will Talbot. He's the only known spy operating this region that gets hung. Tuesday, June 30th, bridge is gone, of course. Now everybody's concentrating on Gettysburg. Here comes Jeff Stewart in New York County. They're going to fight a battle in Hanover. They're going to then fight in Gettysburg, of course, on July 1st. But the spy network's still out there. Why? Because most people are convinced, that, at least in the Confederate Army, they're going to win. We're going to win the Battle of Gettysburg. And so they're still out spying. The sound of battle heard in Columbia, July 2nd. Strangers arrested on July 2nd. 2 citizens of York were arrested in our lines in Columbia as spies. Their names are Fire and Wiley, old citizens of the place. York residents still spying on the Union Army, delivering messages, arrested in Columbia, not strangers to York. Notice that line, old citizens of the place. They went back and looked. Both of their families have been in York County since the 1700s. These are old line York Countyans spying for the Confederate Army. And just in case of July 2nd up in Harrisburg, guards in Harrisburg arrest a man in a rowboat ascending the depth of the Susquehanna River. He's got 2 horses hidden on the island. That's where the ballpark is today. City Island, then known as Forster's Island. He's believed. Whoa. Lost that already. He's believed to be planning a report for rebel locations of all the forts and the number of troops protecting them. Yeah, spies still hanging around the Susquehanna River, trying to figure out what's going on even during the Battle of Gettysburg. With the end of that, no more spy activity is known in York County. So much of this is drawn from newspaper accounts, military records, etc. I've got a few more accounts I'm trying to verify. Eventually, someday, this will be a new book. Spies and espionage in York County. I don't know if they'll ever get in the press, but I might do it. But there's a lot of stuff going on here in this area. A lot of stuff. More than I ever would have dreamed when I first started studying York County history, how organized it really was in this area. And it all dates back to Stonewall Jackson's, give me 36,000 men and I will take the war to the banks of the Susquehanna. From that day until the rebels arrived at the banks of the Susquehanna River, there was all kinds of intelligence being sent, and that map. You've got to see that map sometime. If anybody's ever interested, send me an email, I'll send you a link so you can look at the map yourself. It is incredible. Thanks so much. Adam, I appreciate the New York County History Center's cooperation and support of the New York Civil War Roundtable. With that, have a great night. Time for a couple questions. Okay. Yeah, I'll start with Scott and then I'll get you.
When Hotchkiss and the other people were scouting out and doing the maps, and they marked the farms, so they made me note of who had what loyalties.
No, they didn't. But there were certainly enough accounts that if you're in Southern York County, you're probably not loyal to Lincoln at that point in time. I've actually never seen a connection that this farmer is a Republican, this one. It would have been interesting to find out, but I've never found that. So keep in mind though, one of the key issues is most of the Confederate intelligence records were burned in a warehouse in Richmond in 1865 when Richmond was abandoned. So a lot of this stuff we don't know. It's all just, pieced together from other accounts. Unlike the official records of the BMI from George Sharp, we don't have the Confederate equivalents. We don't know names. We don't know who they were. We've got a few names I pieced together from the records. That's about it. Yep.
Your statistics on the election were incredible. Do you have any statistics on how many of the racial diversity or how many slave owners were in York County?
Well, there were no slave owners in York County during the Civil War. The last slave, Jim, was the 1840s or so down in Hanover. Mark's Forney, the Forney family, down where Turkey Hill is on Forney Avenue. In that area, that's where the last slave who was owned in York County died. So for 15 years, there had not been a slave, almost 20, had not been a slave in York County. So none of these people were current slave owners. Now, in southeastern York County, back in the American Revolution, there were people who owned slaves, and there were scattered throughout the county. Certainly their grandchildren were still alive. Most of those guys were long dead because they gave up their slaves in around the 1800 turn of the century. But some of these people were certainly still descended from people who owned slaves and may have had sympathy to your unstated question. They might have had sympathy to the Confederate cause because of that. But also keep in mind, an awful lot of these people did business with Baltimore County. Baltimore County had slaves. Slavery was very prevalent. A lot of times your business in your county may have depended on your business partners, your suppliers, your customers in Maryland who were using slaves. So yeah, but there were no actual slaves in York County during the Civil War. Great question. Yes.
Did you come upon any codes or ciphers associated?
There are no ciphers or codes known in York County.
Yeah.
There are some Confederate ciphers that are known that were used in other operations. They may or may not have had utility in the Gettysburg campaign. Their actual use is kind of unknown. There is one cipher in the collection, I believe, of the what it used to be called the Museum of the Confederacy, now the American Civil War Museum at Tredegar. I think they still have one in their collection. if I recall correctly.
Okay, are you aware of any that haven't been solved? I know a lot of people like to craft.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's people like, there's also people would like to think there's Confederate gold buried in Franklin County still. Franklin County, but you know, in Cypress that. But yeah, there are some codes that are still out there. I've got a friend of mine who wrote a book on the spy networks in the area. Tom Ryan, I don't know if you ever read his book. Yeah, it's a great book. But Tom knows of some ciphers that I'll try to send him a message. That still hasn't been solved.
Put people together.
Yeah, there are ciphers that have never been solved. Yeah, they still exist. And there are teams that are still amateur cryptologists who are still trying to crack it, but they can't figure it out because the codes are long gone. So, you know, they're looking through Bible verses, they're looking through Shakespeare, they're looking through all kinds of stuff, trying to figure out, you know, page so-and-so, word 6.
These are the best people in the world.
Yeah.
Out.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll try to connect you with Tom to think about it. Grab one of my cards if we're done. Any other questions? Yes,
Here's an online question.
yes,
This is from Gary Nicely.
I do.
Didn't Robert E. Lee have plans to invade Harrisburg as early as 1861 before Jackson's orders to invade Harrisburg?
Robert E. Lee was not in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia until July of 1862. Lee would spend most of 1861 in Western Virginia, fighting at places like Chief Mountain, Rich Mountain, places like that. Then he went to South Carolina at Honey Hill and was putting in entrenchments. In fact, he got the name, you know, Old Granny or Old Spades because they thought he was useless. The only thing Lee was good for was digging entrenchments. So he wasn't around in 61 to worry about what was going on in Harrisburg. It wasn't until he took over in 1862 in the summer, Jackson was transferred to report to Joe Johnston. When he was shot, Robert E. Lee takes over. Jackson now tells Lee his plans about the Susquehanna. And we think that's where Lee gets the idea of invading in just a month later in August. He's obviously on his way to Pennsylvania. They fight at Chantilly and then eventually Bull Run. And of course, turn around and head towards Maryland. Yep, thanks. Public area, they answer your question. If not, send me a message on Facebook. We'll talk more. Yes.
Who was the general that got the report on Wrightsville? The better general?
Oh, the reports on Wrightsville went back to Joe Borley. Joe Borley. Mhm. Well, yeah, I misunderstood your question. The actual map was given to John Gordon, who was reporting to Joe Borley. So it was Gordon that had the intelligence from Wrightsville. He got it from a little girl, supposedly Marianne Small, in a bouquet of flowers, maybe red roses. The accounts vary, but it was Gordon who then had that intelligence, which he passed on to Joe Borley. Okay.
People that were going around selling golden tickets,
Yeah.
were they just considered con men, or were they also involved in other various?
No, there were people from New York City, opportunists, con men, profiteers, whatever you want to call them, who would come through southern York County, Franklin County, Fulton County as well, Adams County, and we're selling for $1. Some accounts say $5, and depending on how wealthy you were. But they were visiting farmers and they were telling them, you know, if you secret signs, if you understand these secret signs and you show them the Confederates, they'll know you didn't vote for Lincoln, you're a friend of the South, and they'll let you go. It turns out, you know, the Confederate Army knew nothing about this. These guys weren't associated with the Army at all. In fact, I have at least 20 different accounts that I've read or have in my collection from Confederate officers and soldiers who talk about seeing these people make and they're all mystified. I mean, none of them knew what was going on. And Spies ended up bragging in July, late July, I can't remember the date. In the New York Herald Tribune, there's actually a great article where they actually named Codorus and North Codorus townships, that these spies write a letter to the newspaper bragging, spies, con men, bragging about the money they took out of the gullible Dutch farmers in the Codorus, as they say. All right, with that again, I'll turn, one more.
Sorry, just one more question.
Sure.
Gary again. Have you found any stories of spies in Dillsburg or the Dover area?
Yeah, there is one story in Gettysburg of a man who is actually arrested and accused of being a spy in Gettysburg. He is actually going to be sentenced to death, and Lincoln will intervene. And it turns out the guy's not a Confederate spy, but he is a Confederate sympathizer, is widely known as a Confederate sympathizer. And it appears that his fellow, remember, Gettysburg's blue. I mean, red, it's a Republican area. And so his neighbors turned this guy, they basically convinced that this guy is a kook. And so nothing ever happens. Spies in Dover, no, I've never found any stories of actual spies in Dover, the area. So thanks again, Gary. All right, with that, I'll turn it back over. If you have any closing remarks, Adam or Scott, thank you again.
All right, thanks to everybody who came in person, and thanks to everybody who joined us online. We had a big turnout tonight, both in person and online. Don't forget, next month, Jim McClure, who is actually present in this room tonight. He's hiding in the back. We'll be back in June to talk about York County and the Civil War, some other things he's uncovered recently. So thanks and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.